lot of seats down in front. We always have. It's easier if I'm sorry. Good evening. It's 7 o'clock, and I believe that starting meetings properly, that's the way you get people to come on time. This looks like a church crowd with everybody sitting in the back. I had a pastor once who said sermon. We'll probably have people coming in later. I hope they won't disturb you. As you know from the mailing, I presume we're going to discuss three topics tonight. Clearly, I think the second topic is the one that we'll devote the most time to, but we also have made a commitment that will be done around 10 o'clock. This is perhaps my one time to employ a recommendation that I made in almost my prehistory in Acton. I was once the chairman of a committee that studied town meeting attendance and times in the 70s. And I recommended that we end the meetings around 10 o'clock to enhance attendance. So where I find I have this meeting more or less under my thumb, I intend to finish it around 10 o'clock. I have been asked to note the absence of several members of the community so that there's no confusion about why they're not here. Town Council has opined that it would not be wise for the members of the Zoning Board of Appeals to be here because there will certainly be some discussion in all probability in regard to 40B in general, Chapter 40B, and perhaps some specific projects, and it would be wise for them not to appear to be involved in those discussions. So the members of the Zoning Board of Appeals are not here. That's Jonathan Wagner, the chairman, David Black, and Kenneth Kuzik, members, Richard Fallon, William Sawyer, and Paul Botas, aldermen. Technically, this is a selectmen's meeting. Believe me, we don't usually get this many people at selectmen's meeting. Trey Schubert also communicated with me and asked to explain his absence. He got stranded in Baltimore when his airplane didn't fly, so he's not with us tonight. It is our intent to give you the maximum time to talk to us, and so I've been fairly brutal with the three presenters who I'm calling pump primers. I've asked them to restrict their comments to 5 minutes to get the discussion started, and I've banned any presentation materials, although I did notice a couple of map boards walk in here. Similarly, I would ask you in making your comments to try and be as succinct and to the point as possible so that as many people, if not everyone, gets an opportunity to be heard. The end of the meeting tonight is not the end of the discussion. If you have something to say that didn't get said, or you want to say it again, or you want to reinforce it, email is a wonderful means of communication. The addresses, I think, for the boards are well known, but if you don't know them, ask me after the meeting, and I'll tell you the ones I can recite from memory. We will have three people, one each for each of the topics here in a moment, who will so-called prime the pump for the discussion. Nancy Tavernier will do the first topic, Peter Ashton will do the second, and Bob Johnson will do the third. This is definitely not a town meeting, but I would like to ask you to observe the same civility that we expect at the town meeting. If speakers are opposing viewpoints and are in the nature of a debate, I would appreciate it if you work it through me, because that tends to keep it from getting personal. As I've said, I may be arbitrary about where we are on time. Also, as you saw in the write-up, we'll try and have a group of comments from the audience. If there's questions in them, before someone gets up and answers or attempts to answer the question, so we don't have a one-to-one from somebody in the official panel to a questioner, but rather to accumulate the questions and then try to take, hopefully, a few minutes to answer all of them. So I think without any further ado, I ask Nancy Tavernier to come forward and get started. We would ask you, after this meeting is over tonight, if you have any comments on how we could have done this better, what we should do if we try it another year, and so forth, we would be delighted. We would urge you, in fact, to send us the comments by email or whatever other way that's convenient for you. Thank you. Nancy.
Thank you, Doreen. Those of you who know me will know that being assigned a topic for 5 minutes was the most challenging assignment I've had in a long time. I hope that didn't count. Okay. My assignment is to introduce the topic of affordable housing in Acton. First, a definition. Housing is affordable if it consumes no more than 30% of your household income. This is a standard across the board measurement for any income. For a housing unit to be officially affordable in the eyes of government, it must be sold or rented to income-eligible households with a deed restriction that maintains that affordability permanently. Acton currently has 180 official affordable units, which equals 235% of our more than 7,600 housing units in the town. The state requires that cities and towns work toward a goal of having 10% of their units affordable. There is obviously an affordability gap in Acton. The gap is the difference between the average selling price of a home and the price that the median Acton residents could pay, based on their median income. That gap last year was $178,000. This gap is high enough to shut out 61% of our present households and 83% of all of the households in the Boston area for anyone who wished to buy a house today in Acton. 2 boards in the town facilitate and oversee affordable housing efforts. The first is the Acton Housing Authority. That is a separate governmental entity that is funded by the state and federal government. It is not part of the town government. The Housing Authority administers public housing, low-income rental programs for households of families, the elderly, and the handicapped. They are based at Windsor Green in West Acton. They have 7 employees, which includes Executive Director Betty McManus. The second board is the Acton Community Housing Corporation, of which I am the chairman. This is a town board appointed by and under the control of the Board of Selectmen. We began in 1985 as a private nonprofit housing partnership group, but have been a town board ever since 1996. We oversee private affordable housing opportunities for moderate income households, primarily through the use of the first-time homebuyers program. We do not own property or sell it, but rather we guide developers through the process of producing and marketing private affordable units to eligible buyers. We have no approval authority. We only make recommendations to those boards that do. ACHC has facilitated the development of 26 housing units purchased or rented by low or moderate income households. These units are in scattered sites around the town, and 70% of them are occupied by families with a local connection. That local connection can be someone who lives in Acton, someone who is the adult child of an Acton resident, someone who works for the town, the schools, the water district, or someone who works for a private employee in Acton. How has Acton obtained these 26 affordable housing units? 3 different ways. The first and most successful way has been through the special permit process through the planning board or the Board of Selectmen. And through this, we have gained 12 affordable units and $500,000 in donations to an affordable housing fund. The second way is through local zoning bylaw, which we have an affordable housing overlay district bylaw. We have generated 4 units from that, and those are all in Harris Village. And the third is through the use of comprehensive permits, also known as Chapter 40Bs. And through those, we have created 10 units. Unlike other communities in the state, Acton has not been overrun by Chapter 40Bs. The total number of Chapter 40Bs that have been approved in Acton since the law was passed in 1969 is only 6. This includes 3 housing authority developments built prior to 1990 and 3 others since 1998. Currently, there are 2 40Bs being heard by the ZBA right now. One is a large rental project in Nagog, in which every single unit there would be counted toward the 10% since it is a rental. And the second is a small 8-unit affordable development where there would be 2 affordable units. Here are reasons to support affordable housing. 1, police officers, firefighters, teachers, nurses, and other essential service workers will be able to live in the town they serve. 2, when the range of affordable housing choices in the area is expanded, it provides more choices for everyone. 3, the development of affordable housing is critical to local businesses and strengthens the economic vitality of our community and region. And 4, young professionals, entry-level workers, and generations of families will be able to live in our community. Thank you.
The floor is now open for what you might want to say, suggestions, comments, or questions. We're looking for feedback. 4 microphones in the aisle, just as there are at town meeting. I think I'll give Jamie precedence there. Crutches. He would have beaten you if he hadn't had the crutches.
I can only stand for 10 minutes, so I thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Jamie Eldridge, 53 Spruce Street. I wanted to talk about affordable housing first from a personal perspective, and then from my perspective as one of the state legislators for Acton. On a personal level,
can everybody hear him in the back? Okay, thank you.
yeah, on a personal level, I grew up in South Acton, of course, came back here after college, still live in Acton, and I think one of the things I appreciated growing up in Acton is the relative economic diversity of Acton. The fact that although I grew up middle class, that I had classmates to the right and left of me who were both more well off and less well off than me. And I think that was something that I took of great value, and I think was an additional thing that I value living in this town is the economic diversity. And I think one of my frustrations is, and I feel very strongly that it's really up to the state to help fix this problem. I think the town and the state need to work together, but I think the state really has to pitch in. But that being said, one of my frustrations is, since growing up in Acton, I haven't really seen much more significant affordable housing. And when I say affordable housing, I'm not even talking about affordable housing as defined by the state under Chapter 40B. I'm talking about more apartment units, more ranch-style houses for young families to move into. The kind of housing that my generation is having a harder and harder time finding in Acton, and that's why a lot of my classmates growing up in Acton, I find living further west, west of 495. And I think that's my perspective is that diversity of affordable housing beyond just what Chapter 40B requires. The second part, which I guess I've seen more as a legislator, is, and Nancy mentioned this, is just the perspective of how this affects the economy and how many small businessmen as well as corporations I've talked to that are frustrated about the lack of affordable housing for everyone from service workers in town to engineers and even some professionals, and how that affects our state, and the fact that many people from my generation and younger are leaving the state in large numbers because they can't find that kind of housing, and how that's going to affect a state that depends so much on the young people who go to college here to create new and innovative ways to create jobs. As a state legislator, I know that when anyone says affordable housing, the first thought is Chapter 40B, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that, and I think what I appreciated about what Nancy said is the fact that affordable housing isn't just about Chapter 40B. But just to focus on Chapter 40B, I just want to reassure those in the audience that there was some efforts in the legislature last year to reform parts of 40B and basically reduce some of the burdens, if you will, on towns, and to count more housing as affordable towards the 10% goal. Today was the the filing deadline for bills, so that bill to change 40B has been filed again. I also filed a bill today that would, as an incentive, increase your Chapter 78 for each new affordable housing unit that's created in any town that has not met its 10% goal. So I just want to assure people here that the state is trying to be more creative in trying to address the issue. But beyond that, I think what the state needs to do is look at directing more state monies directly to the town of Acton so it can build affordable housing on its own terms. We need to look at the affordable housing bond bill and expanding that, especially for suburban communities, and also provide more subsidies for programs like the state version of the Section 8 program. And I say all of that because that sounds very wonderful, and I just want to point out that all of that does require money. I think this is something I might talk about more in the next section in terms of revenues for the town, but the state has a fiscal crisis. I left outside just by all the other, the town warrant, if you will, that was mailed to everyone. There's photocopies outside from the Mass Taxpayers Foundation documenting the state's fiscal crisis. We have a structural deficit of $900 million going into this budget session. So if you're concerned about these, whether it's housing or other things, please communicate to me how you would feel about raising certain revenues, because the state right now is running as a deficit as well. So, thank you.
For those that are coming in, there's still plenty of seats down front next to them.
Hi, Richard DeFuria, Windermere Drive. I have a question and a comment. First, the question is, do our garden-style condo units count towards the 10%? And if not, why not?
I think I can answer that question. Somebody can address it later, but no, they don't, and it's because the law doesn't have a formula that includes them.
Okay, and I guess this is for Jamie then. Can we get those, can we amend the law so that they count towards the 10%? And my comment is, what is magic about 10%? Can we change the law so what is 10%? Why should 10% be the goal? Could it be 5%, 8%? Seems like 10% is a pretty high number to expect towns to have 10% quote affordable housing. I mean, I think it's unrealistic, and frankly, I think it's unattainable.
Thank you. I saw another gentleman standing here. I believe you were next.
My name is Paul Gabry. I'm 12 Assabet Crossing. My partner and I are one of the developers of that 8-unit 40B project in town. And so I'd like to speak both from that point of view as well as from a citizen. One of the things that there's a town bylaw that allows you to do affordable housing, and then there's 40B. From a developer's perspective, we've looked at both. The town bylaw is much more restrictive than a 40B. There are strict limitations and strict rules around which the Board of Appeals can actually override or approve on the town bylaw, which don't come into play when you're a 40B. Furthermore, the town has established affordable housing areas throughout the town, and you'll look at them in a zoning map in the planning department. But so there's a great deal of property in town that's zoned that way, but the town bylaw essentially virtually prohibits any builder from using it, and only one or two so far in all the years have actually employed that town bylaw to do any kind of affordable housing development. So one of the suggestions I would make is that we should get things in sync. We should take our town bylaw for affordable housing and encourage builders to use it instead of all the clout that the 40B process goes through. and refine that law, the town bylaw, so that it, at least at a minimum, is consistent with the state, because it's very inconsistent with the state now. For example, in a town bylaw, you're required to put up 40% of your units as affordable out of the total. In the state, it's 25%. Well, that's a significant difference, and it's all rounded up to a developer. So right off the bat, a developer's not going to do it on that basis alone. On top of that, there are a variety of other things that also are much more restrictive than the state. So we should align our town bylaw to, at a minimum, align with the state, but even better, we should try to make it even more attractive to a developer so that when they go for affordable, they go through the planning department, which has more influence around town, and they can work with them as opposed to going to the state and getting all that clout where you can literally walk in and just, you know, with however much pain you want to put up with, you can put it through. Let's see. So I think that's my first point. I forgot my second point.
If it comes to you, can get.
Oh, the second one. The second point is, as I indicated, there's a great deal of land in town that's zoned affordable. In our experience, there's a disconnect between what we have zoned back in 1990 and what we really want. And from a 40B perspective, whether it's zoned affordable or not, it doesn't matter. A builder can go in and say, I'm going to put a 40B affordable project up, and they're able to do that. If we take that, I think we should go back and review our affordable housing districts and reevaluate them and say what really makes sense now. What ones can we get behind as a town so that when a butter resistance comes along, the town says, look, we've reevaluated this, we voted on it again, and now this is something we're going to support and we're going to put through, and we'll try to get the builders to accommodate whatever they can, but now we've got some more realistic, because these affordable housing districts were established back in 1990. They were approved by town meeting by 2/3. But I would encourage everybody to go into the planning department and look at those in the zoning map and identify them. There's a great deal of them. Thanks.
I think the gentleman in the green sweater back there was the next.
Hi, Jim Snyder, ran 18 Heffernan Hill. I had comments from a couple of different perspectives. One of them was as a member of the Acton Climate Action Team, we're working on figuring out ways of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the town of Acton. And the comment there was just about an advantage of affordable housing that I haven't heard mentioned in the write-up, which is just simply that people living on smaller incomes have a much smaller environmental footprint. To the extent that we can have developable land in town with people living on less money, that means there's fewer large lawnmowers, fewer leaf blowers, fewer huge SUVs, just a smaller environmental impact. It's better for the air, it's better for the town. My second comment was from my hat, a different hat, what I've learned as a member of the Acton Conservation Trust, as a member of the Land Stewards, about protecting wildlife habitat. And this is the question about the location of affordable housing. And this is really more of a question than a comment, because I don't know where to go with this. But I do know that to the extent that we can move affordable housing into areas that are already developed, into the town centers, into areas that already have transportation, we're going to be able to preserve more of the wildlife habitat that we have out in the periphery of the towns. And I guess my question is, how do we do that? It seems like there are local zoning bylaws that encourage that. And I'm wondering, and I don't know the answer, if that's part of what we were hearing from the previous comment, that to the extent that our local laws are too restrictive and developers end up going with 40B, maybe that means that they end up moving more into the areas that need more protection. I'm thinking in particular of the new development that's under permitting process beyond Nagog Park and Woodland Hills, where developers always name their developments after what they have to destroy to put up the development. Woodland Hills means we're going to be destroying a lot of woods, kind of cutting into that North Acton forest. And to the extent that we can have affordable housing more in our town villages, I think that would be a great step forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Two comments, I think, there touched on activities of the planning board, and the chairman of the planning board is here, and a little further along, I'll ask her to respond. In the meantime, if any of you want to add to that list, that's the idea. Next gentleman, we seem to have one microphone is popular, there's no rule against the people on the other side getting up either. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Caleb Pierce, 255 Drum Road, Acton Center. My question is, on this donation that I see over here, like 100K, 94, 400K in 2002, and $3,000 in 202. What's the difference? Why do some donate money, and some don't? In other words, what is the gimmick here? That you see, one is a favoritism, that why someone donates money to the town and others don't? I mean, it seems
We're
that
speaking of developers.
in other words, in the Robbins Mill, the Colonial Acres, on page 11 and 10, on 94, they said the PCRC units, whenever you've got 1,000 or 100K there, just contributed. And on top of page 11, you've got 400K there donated, and 300K. I'm just wondering, why would some of these developers donate money and some don't? Some do and don't. So there must be a reason. Well, we get money from everybody, or we get none from anybody?
And we'll put that on the list of questions. We'll perhaps get a response here too shortly. Tara?
I have several comments. In fact, I have a statement here I'd like to read, because I'm kind of disturbed about how I see things going over a period of years that I continue to write and I go to meetings and things don't seem to be heard. And the biggest problem that I have is that it's sort of interrelated with the planning process, that we don't have a design review board, a group of people that are gathering together to define town character, that are working with developers to show them what we want and what we don't want. This type of thing has worked really well in towns like Newburyport. They don't even have a historic district, yet they're putting up beautiful 8 or 10 unit Georgian Victorian homes. You walk down the sidewalk, you can't even tell which the new building is. So we need to do some work in terms of the general process for affordable and regular building, especially for the affordable. They end up looking like monopoly pieces. We need to have some imagination in terms of planning and design review. The second thing I'd like to say is that I feel as though the affordable housing plan, even though we don't have a formal one and we're working towards a formal one, in the past it hasn't gone through a town-level review. And this is probably my biggest problem with the way things have been developed. They're developed in little silos, and then they come and there's a dog and pony show and everybody accepts it. And I feel as though we need to be more integrated in the way that we do our strategic planning. So I'm just going to read the rest of this here. I'm a strong supporter of public housing. I believe that left to its own devices, unbridled capitalism leaves an unkind society. It's no secret that the rich are getting richer, leaving an increasing number of people living in the streets. Although homelessness in Acton is relatively low, it's still virtually impossible for low-income people to buy homes in Acton. But there's plenty of opportunity for moderate-income families to buy market-rate properties. The mailing says the town's charge, I'm quoting, the town's charge to ACHC is to provide affordable housing opportunities for working families with modest incomes, unquote. This statement is very misleading, and we, the town, have never formally approved of that charge, which virtually ignores low-income people, those who really need our help. We must decide as a town whether we want to serve low-income people or people of average income. This is an important decision, one which will impact the value of your home and the amount of taxes you pay. Currently, we're proceeding with a housing plan that's been developed by housing proponents. It has not been subject to financial analysis by the Finance Committee at the town level. Housing proponents are embracing 40B builds without properly investigating the indirect costs of doing so and without properly investigating alternatives. Evaluation of alternatives has been informally done and been developed with the intent to support a very distinct set of interests that do not consider the rest of the town's interests. This is dangerous because it does not consider the indirect cost to you for a build versus buy strategy. It does not consider the cost of pursuing moderate income housing over low income housing. Pursuing building over buying has inherent and indirect costs to other property owners, so it's important to know how much additional investments investment will be required for us to support the public housing that we are considering funding. My goals are to get the 40B inventory requirements as quickly as possible while reducing the negative impacts to the town as much as possible. This will serve the people that need us the most, and it will cost the least. The current strategy to build new units to satisfy moderate income families costs more on several fronts. A, building versus buying costs more in infrastructure. B, moderate income housing does not contribute more to our 40B inventory than buying. Inventory counts the number of units only, not how comfortable those units are. The extra costs of all of this has not been properly estimated, so we don't know what our kindness is costing us. I agree that it's nice to build luxury moderate income public housing. I just want to know what it's costing us in both the indirect infrastructure costs, the cost of the slow accumulation of 40B inventory, and the cost of oversaturating housing supply on our home values. I'm a strong believer that moderate income people should buy market rate, even if it's not a luxury townhouse. They're better off in the long run. They do not get trapped in a public housing black hole. Buying market rate allows the owners to enjoy the benefits of appreciation, often 10% or more per year. Deed-restricted properties do not. I believe that public housing money should be focused entirely on helping low-income people buy their first homes. Low-income families will never be able to buy anything on their own without assistance. These are the people that need our help. Unlike moderate-income people who might prefer the affordable housing lottery process to buy it over buying a small apartment, low-income people don't have that choice. They will never qualify for homeownership without assistance. They would love to get the chance to own a 2-bedroom condo. The qualified low-income people of which I speak are not bums any more than the moderate-income people are. They are teachers and artists and disabled people, just like the moderate-income people. The only difference is in their ability to make money. I encourage the town to focus a greater percentage of public housing to serve low-income families. B, do a town-level analysis to the indirect costs of buying versus building. Existing units are already accounted for in town infrastructure costs, traffic analysis, and market supply versus demand elasticity impacts. New units are likely to cost you far beyond the direct cost of the unit itself. These indirect costs include extra taxes to cover infrastructure that's not covered in the taxes from that unit. The indirect costs include increased traffic and increased burden on safety infrastructure. And the indirect cost to you may even include a decrease in the value of your home if the market is overbuilt. I take strong issue with the claim in the State of the Town mailer, which says, quote, the demand exceeds supply and rents are high, when referring to the rental units in town. I have a 2-bedroom unit that has been vacant for 3 months. There are ads for over 25 empty apartments, where rents were $1,000 a month a couple of years ago. This year, they're under $900. I have gotten no calls in 3 weeks for this apartment. I got one call from a guy in Lowell this weekend. He said, $875, does that include heat? No, sorry, that's too expensive. We're barely breaking even. The values are plummeting. And I believe that the cost of overbuilding must be included in the analysis of the public housing strategy. I believe that the indirect cost of infrastructure must be included in the analysis of buy versus build. I don't mind paying my fair share of these costs, but I do want to know ahead of time what the extra cost is for building versus buying. And I want someone besides the housing proponents to do that analysis. The housing proponents want to increase the number of total units in town, regardless of the cost to you or to us. If we are serious about meeting the requirements of 40B at the lowest cost possible, let's look at the alternatives. Buying existing properties may have the least negative impact to town, while at the same time increasing the affordable housing stock at a faster rate. I encourage you to contact your town leaders and request that a formal analysis be done at the town level to ensure that you know what the costs are before you vote on the CPA funding, before you vote on any public housing funding, and before you vote on the overall strategy for funding public housing.
Thank you. If any of you have a written statement you want to read, having reduced it to writing, it might be helpful if after the meeting you send us a copy where some of us are taking notes, but clearly we wouldn't have gotten all that written down. I think Mr. Adelman was next.
Thank you, Dory. Very briefly, to follow on some of the comments that were just made, and a discussion about affordable housing wouldn't be complete with a little bit more discussion about what's being proposed anachronistically, as the first speaker said, as Woodlands in Nagog Office Park, where 350 units are being proposed, about 15 units per acre. So I think when we're talking about the quality of housing, we can talk a lot about the desirability of affordable housing, but we have to talk also about the reality of what the current law provides. And I think I'm very pleased, Representative Eldridge, that you're here, as well as other state officials. There's a fundamental flaw in the law that permits developers to structure the deal so that then the town boards, who work furiously on just keeping the town running, have to then work overtime to review these, I would say, largely flawed economic analyses submitted by the developer, where this proposal, some units are in Westford, 296 units are in Acton. And as I mentioned, 15 units per acre is the density, and $1,500 per month is the proposed rent. So listen to that number compared to what the woman just previously said. You drive up and down Route 2A, and you can rent a two-bedroom apartment for $900 to $1,100 a month, including utilities, and the $1,400 to $1,500 a month that's proposed for the, quote, affordable housing does not include utilities. So I think that we need to take this proposal very seriously. I think people in town need to be aware that there are 180 two-bedroom units being proposed in this project, and the developer estimates there'll be 30 to 40 children. I think most people can question if they rented a two-bedroom apartment, they probably have a child. So we should be thinking about the impact on the town, town services, schools, and fundamentally as to whether or not the population intended is actually being served. I do not believe at this point that the current proposal of Woodlands at Laurel Hill includes any permanent deed restriction to keep the rents affordable over time. Thank you.
Anyone else wish to speak to this topic? Somebody's watching the sound back there. Could you fix that so that I can get your microphone out? Feedback.
Hi, I'm Scott Smyers from 382 Central Street, and I was interested to hear one of the gentlemen earlier talking about the possibility of revisiting some of the zoning requirements locally, because I think a lot of people have to realize that most developers go to the 40B process through the state only as a last resort. It's kind of a painful process from what I understand, and takes quite a long time and a lot of resources going through that effort. And if the town was to make it a little bit easier, but they would also be able to exert more control over development such as that. I mean, it's really because of the zoning requirements in the town that the state had to step in and make these things a mandate statewide. If we didn't have half-acre or acre zoning in different areas, then there could be more clustered developments that maybe not everybody in this room wants to live in, but that's not necessarily what the market is looking for either, and it's all market-driven. So I'd encourage the planning board to consider that option, to basically revisit their own zoning requirements and make it facilitated somewhat for the developers to work through the town and not have to go and usurp the town bylaws by going through the state 40B process. The other thing I just wanted to mention was that when we talk about the density of development in some of these proposed projects, you also have to look at the big picture and ask yourself the question as to how much land is it proposed to take place on, and oftentimes you'll find that there's going to be a lot of open space that will be more or less permanently restricted and preserve a lot more woods than if you had an acre lot per house in a lot of these areas. So that's often an advantage to preserving open space on town property, and I think it can be a good thing. But if the town could reconsider their own bylaws and zoning requirements, sometimes a monumental task, but it may be worth it in the long run. Thanks.
Thank you. I'm going to allow about 20 more minutes for this topic, and then I want to take about 5 minutes for the planning chairman to respond to various questions. So if you can be succinct, I'd appreciate it. Next gentleman.
Yes, Mike Fritzy, 6 Old Surrey Drive. Just a very quick little question. I'm just curious, how much land is potentially available for affordable housing in Acton? Are there numbers? I mean, I know that they don't have to live within the zoning, you know, the town bylaw zoning, but is there some estimate of how much land is available that could potentially be used for that purpose?
Next gentleman, same microphone.
Yeah, Halo Pierce, 2 Drum Road, I can send it. The question I have is, one is a comment. I'd like to thank the developer for earlier expressing that the disparity between the A and B town bylaw and 40B of 40% affordable, I think it certainly seems ridiculous, and at 10% is no doubt a rabbit out of the hat. And so who knows if 10% is right, but certainly 40% is certainly ridiculous. I think the town should get together and cut that down to a reasonable figure. The second comment I have is asking a question: with 180 units, what is the turnover rate of the 180 units?
Josh Chernin, Central Street. The elephant in the living room is that when any housing stock in town is added, whether it's affordable or not, it puts a strain on the town's infrastructure and primarily the schools. And we're going to be talking about that a lot later on tonight. But I'm sure one of the big concerns, and one of the speakers already alluded to it, with the Nagog Park proposal and with others, is, you know, how many children and what is the impact on the schools and what does it really cost? At some point, someone can do an analysis of, you know, the number of kids that are likely to live in those apartments and what the long-term cost to the town is. But it's true when you add any housing stock, it isn't just affordable. I was also interested to learn in the materials, and I didn't know this, that a unit that has a market value within the range that's considered affordable under 40B is not considered affordable under 40B. It doesn't count toward the 10% unless it's deed restricted. I didn't know that. So I was thinking about putting two and two together. How do you increase the stock of affordable housing, which I think, absent the infrastructural cost concerns, there would be a good deal more support for. I think the sentiment is that, other things aside, we'd like to see more affordable housing. So how do you reconcile those two? And I have a germ of an idea, and I don't know if it's a good idea or not, but maybe someone can comment on it. There are in Acton some number of units that would be affordable and would be counted as affordable if they were deed restricted. The question is there some way that the town can incent the owners of those properties to deed restrict their properties? Now, obviously, what you're asking people to do is to cap the market valuation of their town. I assume that the definition of affordable housing is indexed in some way to inflation. I don't know if that's true, but I'll assume for the sake of argument that it is. So suppose you have some owners who own units in the $150,000 to $190,000 range. Could the town project what the cost of adding housing stock would be on the schools and say, we'll split the difference with you and abate your property taxes in such a way that the cost of the town is less than the cost would incur if another housing stock, affordable or not, were added? Now that would have to be a sliding scale, I guess. The relationship between the real market value and the affordable housing definition of affordable would have to be indexed so that the abatement would be less for someone who owns a unit at the low end of that scale than for someone who owns a unit at the high end of the scale. And perhaps could be even done for someone who owns a unit that's slightly above that scale. I think there's perhaps an analogy in the 61A program. It's not exactly the same thing, and it's certainly not for the same purpose. But perhaps we can work with that idea. Thank you.
Yes, I'm Graham Nolan at 29 Estabrook Road. To try to keep my comments brief, I'll read from my list here. The town of Acton spent a good deal of time and money to produce master plans, which all included sections on housing. This issue, as with many others, cannot and should not be taken in isolation. These master plans stress the importance of maintaining the character of the town and preserve its high quality of life. These goals have been too readily forgotten or jettisoned for the sake of expediency. The town government seems to speak with conflicting voices and action. There is a loss of a common vision of action. The previous master plan identified the importance of preserving certain farmland and rural properties in Acton. Of those listed, the majority have been developed. Affordable housing is important. It can be provided at a scale and density that does not destroy the neighborhoods it is located in. I would hope that the town, when it is reviewing projects and working towards projects, will keep this in mind. Thank you.
Seeing no one else standing at the moment, Lauren, if you want to try and answer any of the questions that you can in a few minutes, please do so.
Hi, I'm Lauren Rosenzweig, Chair of the Acton Planning Board. And within your State of the Town meeting booklet is a synopsis of a study that the Planning Board did with a grant this year called To Live in Acton. And we are well aware of the shortfalls of our planning efforts within affordable housing. One of the problems was that when it was addressed in the master plan in the 1990s, the early 90s, nobody predicted how high values would skyrocket in town. And because of that, the land prices have skyrocketed as well. And one of the difficulties in getting affordable housing units on a piece of property is that the cost is so high that the density has to be high to keep up with subsidizing the market rate unit for the affordable units. So that was one of the things that happened, and that's why 40B has become so much more appealing. And what we're trying to do, and what we've done with our special permits to answer the special permit question, when we have a special permit, we ask the developers, and most of the developers are people that either came from town, grew up here, some of them, and some had lived here for a number of years, and really wanted to contribute to affordable housing. And when asked, depending on the project, they either donated and built units that would be deed restricted within the development, or they might have preferred to give a cash donation, and that was pretty much negotiated with the cooperation of the ACHC. And they have a very nice cooperative process with developers to, state their needs, and also to listen to developers' needs and their difficulties. So, win-win does pay off, and it was we've gotten some good units through that. Also, developers have chosen to buy up existing units, rehab them, bring them up to code, and that has provided some very, very nice living situations for people in the moderate income range who otherwise could not afford a single-family home for themselves and their family. So those have been extremely successful. Unfortunately, there's just not been enough. And we keep working towards that anytime we do have a special permit situation. And even when we don't, we always ask, could you please? And they've been extremely cooperative, so we thank them. Let's see, I think another question was about design review, and that's something that when we did the To Live in Acton study came up a lot, and we do feel on the planning board that design is extremely important, and that buildings blending into town character is extremely important. I did sit on the revision committee for the historical district, and I will say that it's very, very difficult to zone taste. And so those are some of the difficulties that you get when you have design review, is what one person thinks is beautiful and acceptable, somebody else might not. So it does get into some difficulties, and there are some legal difficulties. But we are open to anyone who would like to come forward and help us with improving the design of buildings in Acton. And Okay, I'm trying to think if I missed any questions. In response to Mr. Gabory's question about really relooking at the planning zoning issues for affordable housing, the study does give a lot of suggestions, and we will be running a process with the selectmen to try and revamp a lot of the overlay district ideas, or looking at really creative solutions. And for that, we will need people's input, because one of the criticisms is that people think we're arbitrarily looking at sites to put affordable housing. Our preference is to put it into village districts, places where people can walk to nearby amenities. And that's been one of the strong pushes that we've had. It's smart growth to put affordable housing where there's infrastructure already, and where you don't have to put things in the middle of nowhere and take down woods and that kind of thing. We do have cluster zoning, and that has helped a lot, I think, in stemming the tide of 40B, because a 4-bedroom house in Acton tends to be less expensive than a house in another town. So, and that is partly because of our cluster zoning, because builders can build them for less money because they're closer together. And there's less road infrastructure and things like that. So that has been helpful. And again, I hope you'll be part of the process, and I appreciate your time. Thank you.
I'm now, as I said, we're going to be arbitrary and shift this to topic 2. We're not following Robert's rules, but what do you have to say, sir?
Hello, Pierce. 2 questions I had. One was the negotiated money that was donated. How did the planning board negotiate 400,000, 300,000? How did that do? Was some developers don't prepare? That was
What I
answered.
would suggest you do is have a discussion with Ms. Rosenzweig or somebody else in the planning board. Meanwhile,
On the 180 turnover, I asked about the turnover for the 180 units.
we will get you an answer, sir. We're just not going to do it right now. We're now going to pass on to the money or topic, however you want to style it, which Peter Ashton is the pump primer, and he's on his way up with his pump handle.
Thank you, Doré. I will try and speak loudly if you can't hear me, and so I don't get any feedback, but I will try to adhere to the chair's request and be brief. I trust everyone has at least had a chance to review section 2 of the booklet, so as a result, I will assume that you've at least scanned it and read it, and I'm sure there will be questions. The town's leadership this year has been exploring many different financial options for the years ahead, and I hasten to add that there is no final plan at this point, part of why we're here this evening. We are working both on a plan for the coming year, fiscal year '06, as well as a 3-year plan that will take us through fiscal year '08. We do this not because we have a crystal ball, but because prudent fiscal management dictates that we attempt to plan not only for the coming year, but also consider the impact of choices we make now on future years. The purpose of this discussion this evening, I hope, is to make citizens aware of the difficult choices that lie ahead of us, and to seek positive feedback on these options, both in terms of desired level of services and the impact of such choices on our property taxes. Briefly, the major issues facing the town from a financial perspective are as follows. Revenues continue to be depressed from the levels experienced just 3 years ago. We rely most heavily in this town on property taxes as well as state aid as revenue sources. State aid is down over $1.5 million from its peak in FY02. Other revenue sources, in particular new growth, that which comes from new construction, are also down significantly. And Proposition 2.5 obviously constrains our ability to raise property taxes more than 2.5% a year without an operating override. At the same time, in order to provide the level of services that our citizens expect, our budgets have been increasing at an annual average rate of slightly less than 6% per year over the last 10 years. We have funded these increases through increases in state aid, taxes from new growth and new construction, and the use of free cash, as well as a $3 million operating override 2 years ago. And in recent years, and I think this is a very important point, prudent management has perhaps all too successfully masked the impact of fairly significant budget cuts. This year, we are at a crossroad with regard to the future of the town. As we have tried to explain in the State of the Town booklet, the town's leadership sees the need for a large operating override this year if we are to keep service levels close to what they have been in the past. And even at moderately high override levels of between 3 and 4.5 million, there will be further cuts in services. This is what we have come to term, and I heard Representative Eldridge use it at the state level, and it is certainly true at the local level, a structural deficit imposed at the local level in part by Proposition 2.5. Budgetary needs, not wishes, that outstrip our ability to raise revenue within the constraints of Proposition 2.5. And in the current environment, with no alternative source of revenue to pick up the slack. The booklet lays out 4 different approaches to budgets and operating overrides and describes the budgetary impacts of each. These range from no operating overrides in any of the next 3 years, to the other end of the spectrum, to what it would take to fully meet our projected needs over the next 3 years, and to what I've come to term middle-of-the-road options. The town's leadership at this point is not committed to any of these options at this point, but we have presented them to provide you with some feel for the choices to be made and the cost in terms of the impact of each on your property taxes. While you may not agree with any of these scenarios or any one of them, what we are looking for this evening is your feedback on what level of tax increase you would find palatable, and given that choice, how you would prioritize the services that the town and the schools provide, and which services should be eliminated or reduced. We look forward to hearing what you have to say on this very important issue, and I stand ready to try and answer questions later on, as do several of my colleagues here who will be with me to answer questions as well. I have Jonathan Chinitz, who's the chair of the Finance Committee, Maria Altieri, the chair of the Acton Public School Committee, and Mary Ann Ashton here as vice chair of the Acton-Boxborough Regional School Committee. Thank you. Okay, your turn.
My name is John Benson, and I live on Beacon Hunt Drive. I served as a member of the Acton Finance Committee from 1983 to 86, and was vice chairman for one of those years. And those were the initial years of 2.5. And as the group of us sat around and wondered how are we going to make this all work, whether you were a Republican or a Democrat or a liberal or a conservative, we all said if we're going to maintain this level of services, you're going to have to override 2.5. And the sense that we had was probably every 3 years an operational override was necessary. Maybe with some good fortune you could stretch it out to a 4th year. So I would submit that the nub of our present financial crisis is our failure to override. I think we've had one successful override since 1991. And the way we've kept this going, and I think Peter hit the point, how we've masked it is by using free cash and cutting budgets and cutting employees to the bare bone, to the point where we can't cut it anymore. Now, most certainly, the problem has been exacerbated by the increasing enrollment in our schools, right from the kindergarten level through the high school. But that's something we knew about a decade ago. Certainly, the increase in medical insurance costs and the recent requests for additional funding for a very poorly run county retirement system, which has really been underfunded. However, I don't think as a town we can expect to catch up for what's not taken place over the past 13 years and raise property taxes by as much as 30% as one of the proposals sets out. Now, I may likely vote for something like that, but I do find it very troubling. I live in Minuteman Ridge, and our tax bills are, in that neighborhood of 82 homes, are approaching $8,000. And I would imagine if we get a 30% increase in taxes, that would push it north of $10,000. And I think many of my neighbors who have children in the schools would find it very difficult to support something like that. As a town, we can't lose sight of the fact that notwithstanding all the glitzy homes that we hear that are built here, these 4,000, 5,000, and 6,000 foot homes, most of Acton is still relatively modest homes. I think in many ways it's a very good thing. And our young families, many of them stretch to come here because of the schools, I think only have so much money to spend on all this stuff. So I see myself as someone who sees a commitment of intergenerational obligations and responsibilities. We have an obligation to support public education in much the same way as we have an obligation to support Social Security and Medicare. There was an interesting anecdote a couple of years ago when Concord was going through either an operational override or a building program. A member of their school committee said to me, he was approached by a lady who was probably about 80 years old and said, "You know what? I support you. You're surprised, aren't you?" And he goes, "Well, yeah. Why?" And she said, "I remember 40 years ago when we were in a building program that would affect my kids, and there were so many seniors who came up to us and said, 'It doesn't affect us anymore. We're not going to support it.' And she said, 'I never wanted to be like those people.'" What I think we have to do, and this would be my proposal, is an override of $5 million, perhaps as much as $5.5 million. But the idea of it would have to get us through 2006, 2007, and 2008. The schools, the high school, the junior high school, would have to look again to the choice program, which was very successful through the 1990s. It appears that there's the space for it. Now, understanding, in doing something like that, you're going to have to confront the moral issue, because in taking choice kids, you're taking better kids out of less affluent systems. And also, there was issues in the last couple of years of choice where you attract a lot of good kids, and they were taking positions on some of our competitive no-cut sports teams, and there was a lot of flack about that. I also think we have to look to a modified private school model and look to fundraising. I would suggest at the high school level, an organization, alumni, and parents association. I think there's a lot of parents here, there's a lot of alumni who've had very good feelings about their experience at Acton Boxborough, and I think those can be tapped. On the junior high school level, I think you could go to a parents association. I would also like to see that when we set out an override of this magnitude, that it be broken up into 3 separate questions: the amount attributable to the town, the amount to the regional schools, and the amount to the local schools. And this would follow what I saw as a very successful trend in Lexington and Concord, where they went to this method, in large part based on the notion that people really wanted to be able to look at this thing individually and have an opportunity to vote. And in both those towns, it was successful on both the school and the town end. So those are my thoughts.
Thank you, sir.
Chuck Olmsted, 18 Kingsley Road. Since I've lived here, which is 14 years, the median sales price of a single-family home has increased at slightly more than 5%. So if you net out inflation, it's slightly less than 2%. So the story that our services and our schools are building wealth and our real estate value is not quite true. And we have to be very careful about what future taxes will do to the values of our homes. Looking at the proposed budgets, the problem really is with the services provided by the schools. We have, when I was a member of the FinCom years ago, the split between the schools and the town was one-third schools, one-third town, two-thirds schools, which is now less than one-quarter of the town, three-quarters schools. And that's caused a great strain on the services provided by the town. And even more importantly, we have neglected the maintenance of our infrastructure because of not enough money to cover all the bases. I would just like to raise a few questions. I don't know that I have the answers, but if you look at the Acton Public Schools, the students have increased over the last 8 years at a rate of about 1.6%, from 22 to a little over 2,500 people, those students. The certified staff has increased by 2.3%. The other staff has increased by about 1%. Now, if you compare the certified staff increase with the student staff, there are 10 more teachers now than there were 8 years ago. The high school, the students have increased by 4.4% annually. Certified staff has increased by 5.1% annually. The non-certified staff has increased by about 4% annually. So if you compare the certified staff with the student increase, there are 11 extra students. 11 extra teachers. Now, I've read in and I want to thank the people who provided the booklet. It was very, very helpful. We have a very motivated student body who take extra courses. My question is, are these extra teachers required for these extra courses? If so, that's a very focused benefit, but the cost is spread very widely. I would also raise the issue of our relationship with Boxborough. 1/3 of the growth in our high schools come from Boxborough. And I remember it was, I think, 3 town meetings ago, we had this discussion about the so-called 5% limit that Boxborough would pay. I think it's time to revisit our relationship with Boxborough, because they are now not a small contributor to the Acton Boxborough Regional High School. I think I have a fundamental question about the quality of the services provided by the schools. It's very high. Can we afford it? I remember, I think it was 12 years ago when I was on the FinCom, I raised the issue of wages or salaries for town and school employees. And that time was when the great increase in health benefits became apparent. And I argued at the time that we should consider the compensation for town and school employees as a total package, compensation plus benefits plus retirement. Otherwise, we would be in big trouble if we negotiate on one component, then another component, and another component, as opposed to putting them together in one package. Clearly, most taxpayers, their compensation is determined that way. It's not just salary, and then you negotiate salary, then you negotiate your fringe benefits, then you negotiate your retirement. It's all taken together. And I think unless we do that, we're going to have a very difficult time controlling our costs. Thank you.
Again, let me say that if any of you have written remarks, you've already written it down, even though you've said it here, it would be helpful if we got that period of note-taking. I'd like to see if we can pick up the pace a little bit. If we go about 10 minutes a speaker, which is what we seem to be doing, a lot of people, I think, that want to say something aren't going to have a chance to say it tonight. If you have a thought that you didn't get a chance to communicate tonight, that's not the end of it. We're all on email. Let us have it. I'll go over to this microphone.
Thank you, Dorian. Ken Quirk, 7 McLeod Lane. I will be brief. My point here is actually not to address these particular issues, except to say the problem we have here, there is a structural issue. We're relying on a fundamentally regressive tax. We're taxing people on assets they have that aren't liquid. And so when we rely on property taxes to fund our operations within the town, we're getting into the kind of situations we have now, where there are people in this town who literally can't afford to live in their own houses because of taxes. I, understand and appreciate that. And so what I would like to challenge all of us here to think about is, and this is something that would have to be addressed at the state level, and it's not going to be addressed in the next year. But we need to think about the question of how do we figure out how to go with a less regressive tax and start thinking about whether it's asking the state, which is already funded based on more of a, an income tax-based system, to get more money to the towns. That, requires applying some pressure to our state legislature. But Ed just suggested to me another option, which is an income tax that, again, would have to be modified by the state constitution, but that would be dealt with in targeted funds directly to the towns. And the point being that those who can pay more should pay more, and that shouldn't be based on how much house you have. Thank you.
Over here.
Amresh Mahapatra, 10 North Bray Road. I have some general comment on after having read this document here, where 4 different levels of override have been suggested, all the way from 2.5% to almost override, which would increase taxes by 30%. It's a very big range. I try to read the data in this presentation and try to rationally understand which level of override would actually make sense with regard to maintaining the quality of the schools. And I must say that I don't find that data included here. I find this deficient. For example, if you look on page 48, there is a graph which shows the student enrollment increasing. It also shows the certified staff increasing, and it shows non-certified staff. The first question I had was, for example, in 2004, there's roughly 270 total staff, certified and non-certified. The question that comes to mind is how many of those are teaching staff? How many are coaches? How many are administrators? I mean, these are issues which are not. I would have thought that it would be fairly obvious to include that type of data. I went on the AV school website to see if I could maybe get this information. Maybe I didn't search enough, but I certainly didn't find it. So it left me unable to really, in my mind, rationalize some numbers. Early on in the discussion, it also says, this document on page 46 says that the class size has increased from 21.6, let's say 22 students in 2001-2002, to 25 in 2004-2005. Now, is that bad? Is that good? What is fundamentally wrong with that? What is a good number? A lot of the comparisons in this document are made between roughly 25 townships which are considered to be in the same group as Acton. 25 is not a large enough number. In other words, what I'm getting at is just merely doing statistical analysis and comparison of where Acton falls into the scheme of things within 26 towns is not a way to do it. At some point, as the school committee or the teachers or the principals must ask the question, what is fundamentally needed? What are the absolutes? What's a good class size? What's a good expenditure per student and so on? Merely doing statistical comparison really does, as a citizen, is not giving me enough information to make a rational decision between a 4.5 million override or a 2.5% override or a 7 million override. It really needs much more information than that. Thank you.
All right, let's go back over here. Alan Wirtz, Old Village Road.
I'd like to, first of all, commend whoever put the book together because it was a pretty good primer, at least for me when I went through it. However, I do agree with the last speaker in that there's not enough information available either here in the primer or where I could go get it to be able to note whether I would be in favor of what level of override we ought to have. I would make the following suggestion for consideration, that between now and the time that we vote, we create a one-to-end list, let's call it that, so that we get away from a school budget, perhaps that's based upon a percentage from historical, what happened last year, but broken down into its sub-elements to some degree, and weighted by the leadership in the town relative to all the sub-elements of the departments within the town. So that you have a one-to-end with number one being the top priority and number N being the least in someone's idea. You can put that out for people to comment on. They can provide comments back, take a look at the comments, adjust if necessary, and walk down your one-to-end list, draw your line where your 2.5% is level, and then make the suggestion of, here's what happens if we have a $4 million override. You can go down through the sub-projects. And it gets away from the emotional element of, boy, if I don't get that $7 million override, we're going to drastically decrease the quality of our education because your projects are going to be intertwined. It won't be one department that's up on the top and carrying the spear, the head of the spear, so to speak. And you'll allow every voter to see that the next 10 projects, these are the 10 projects that won't be funded if we don't get the override. It makes it very objective. It makes it very easy for a voter to sit back and say, do I think those next 10 projects are worth X amount of dollars out of my pocket? It's a one-to-end list. Industry does it yearly, and when you do that, it makes going from year to year a lot easier to understand, is it worth that next amount, as opposed to simply focusing on the schools and whether we're going to have 10 or 15 layoffs if I don't get 7 million or 3 million or whatever it happens to be. So that would be a suggestion. It's difficult to do. It's hard to prioritize. But once you get into the process of doing it, it becomes fairly easy year to year for accountability also. Thank you.
Let me take this opportunity. I was hoping somebody would give me an intro here about the booklet. We haven't done this before, and we, with a very short, thin staff, asked for contributions from the various elements of town and school organizations, and there were people who worked nights and weekends to edit and put all this together. And frankly, I think it came out pretty well. We probably could do a lot better. But this was a very considerable effort. There are a number of the staff people here that worked on it, and I think they all deserve a hand of applause. Thank you. I only allotted 10 seconds per point. Let me, you would be next, sir, but Mr. Eldridge is standing there on crutches. If you don't mind. It's a good tactic to get people,
But I'm not actually injured. Thank you very much for I spoke before, Jamie Eldridge, 53 Spruce Street. I spoke before on the issue of affordable housing, and I made a slight mention to the issue of state revenues, and I just wanted to sort of hit that home. I know today's discussion obviously is more focused on how we're going to focus on covering the town budget for the next year. And obviously that's going to be decided at the local level, but I really want to encourage, especially with such a great attendance here, the people to really think about how the state can play a greater role in taking care of some of these unfunded mandates and some of the just natural increased costs of education and basic municipal services for the town of Acton. And with respect to that, before I talk a little bit about some of the numbers, I just wanted to say that as someone who grew up here and served on town boards and now works with the Board of Selectmen, the school committee, the town manager, I do feel very strongly that this town is very well managed. There is very little, if any, waste within the town government, and I don't think that's the problem here. I think the problem here is how do we pay for these things with some of the increased state mandates and just the general increased cost in the town. I mentioned earlier, and I think probably all the copies might have been taken up, but outside, I photocopied and put outside 3 reports from the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, which is known as a fiscally conservative independent think tank on Beacon Hill that a lot of House and Senate leadership rely on in terms of figuring out the state budget for Massachusetts. And I'd encourage you, if you didn't get a chance to get a copy, to please look up on masstaxpayers.org, and these reports that I'm referencing will be there. But in terms of the state finances, I want to first of all remind people that unfortunately it's expected that the state will once again have a structural deficit. Peter Ashton mentioned the fact that the town has a structural deficit, the state has a structural deficit, mostly because of Medicaid costs, free Medicare medical services we provide for those who can't afford it. That's an increase of about $500 million next year. The federal government, for various reasons, will be decreasing its reimbursement to the state by $600 million. We have debt service for the bonds and the debt that Massachusetts takes out to pay for roads and other programs. And then things like this past year, we did the school building assistance reform, and that's going to cost more because we'll be providing more money up front to the town. These are all extra costs that the state has. And the reason I bring this all up, because I strongly agree with one of the gentlemen who spoke earlier about how regressive the property tax, and to have more of a conversation about whether various different sources of revenues from the state level need to be looked at to be increased, whether it's corporate taxes, the state income tax, various other ways to raise revenue. And I really encourage to hear from people about their opinions on that, because, you know, thinking about how the system of funding education can be changed, the legislature over the past year, we increased the special ed circuit breaker fund. I mentioned the school building assistance reform. But what I just, asked to put into your head in terms of some positive solutions here is, we're going to be revising the Education Reform Act over the next year because of the Supreme Court decision on how Massachusetts funds education. Imagine a system where every single town, regardless of their wealth or the lack thereof, 30% of education costs are paid by the state. Imagine a system where special education is entirely paid by the state. A system where regional school transportation is entirely paid by the state. If these sort of costs were taken out of the equation for towns to figure out how to pay, it would be a lot easier for town government, its town boards, and its citizens every year to meet their budget requirements. And I just ask to think about that, how you feel about that, and how you feel about the revenues it might take to meet those obligations. Thank you.
Now, sir. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. Bob Hakeman, Magog Woods. This discussion was framed as an exploration of how we can find money to increase revenues to the town. I'd like to have a discussion on how we can deal with runaway costs. Not just a presumption of the inevitability of continuing increases. And we're always asked not to make choices, as if we live in a society without limits. Years ago, when we were assembled to discuss or consider the school override, we were asked, don't consider any other needs in the town. Focus today on the schools. Well, that's absurd, but that's what we did, and that's what we continue to do. There are connections. We had a discussion about 40B. There's a connection between 40B problems and what we're talking about now. And most of those are driven by, it appears, our school system. A sacrosanct subject. We have a runaway train.
People are attracted to this community because it is said of the quality of the schools. Well, the people that are attracted here are people who are education-oriented, bringing children who are predisposed to succeed and have high scores, again, increasing the reputation of the school, which brings more people, which increases the pressure on the land that we have available for development, excluding low-income people. I don't think there's a connection between the quality of the school and the money we're putting into the school. It's the people that are coming here that are raising the school reputation. I would also like to hear some discussion about where is the productivity increases that have benefited other sectors of our society over the past decade. Tremendous productivity increases. I don't see them reflected in the town budget. I see someplace in that booklet, we want some money for technology. What for? Technology's been with us for at least 10, 20 years. What productivity increases has the town realized as a consequence of increases in productivity? We have to make choices. There are limits. Thank you very much.
All right, I have been alternating, but we seem to have more people on my left than on my right, so I'm going to stay over at that microphone and balance a little bit.
Okay, my name is Michael Gould. I live in Navy Woods. I heard a couple of points made before that the revenue are depressed. That's one point. Second one, that we are raising the taxes on a 2.5% while covering the budget by 6%. And how does it come out? And let's have a look at page 37. A very nice graphic, but the person who made this graphic, I don't know exactly what he had in his mind. Because if you look at it, it shows the very top line is the inflation in Massachusetts. The second line is how the expenses would grow if we use the override 2.5. And the very low line is how actually the budget for the town services grew. So it looks like it's even below if we would use 2.5%. But let me give you a couple numbers. In 1990, the total budget, because like the previous person just said over here, we have to look at the total budget. We don't have to micromanage our management. They can do the job. So in 1990, the total budget of the town was $24,800,000. In 2005, it's 60 million. The increase by 140%. The increase in the population from 1990s, it was 17,872 people. In 2000, the last census, is just 20,331, an increase on 13.7%. So where does the money come if we spend 6% per year more and just use the taxes by 2.5% per year? I'll tell you why. I'll give you my own example. And when I came to this town in 1990, I paid $2,000 tax. And I live in a townhouse, so I didn't have any additions. I don't require any more land. Nothing added to my townhouse. And now I pay $4,600, an increase of 130%. So I don't understand when people say we live within 2.5 almost and spend 6.
So I think that the data over here doesn't actually show what is actually happening in our town. And I think we should prepare it a little bit better. Thank you.
Lady on my right. Thank you very much. I'm Pat Ellis, 297 Old High Street. I'm chair of the board of Acton Council on Aging. Just wanted to make a statement about what raising taxes does to senior citizens in this town, and hope that all sorts of consideration will be given to ways and means to make it possible for senior citizens to continue to live in the town that they love and not be forced to leave because of taxes that are way beyond their means. Thank you very much.
I think actually you were the next person up, Pam, so let's go to you.
Thank you. Pam Harding-Baird, United Group. I've had the privilege in this town of serving on the planning board and the school committee and the board of selectmen and now the board of health. And despite my husband's urging me to join Volunteers Anonymous, it's a very humbling experience to get multiple perspectives. Most importantly, as a parent, our children percolated through the school system. Our younger daughter graduating from high school in '94 and our older daughter in 1990. Interestingly, in 1998, when my younger daughter graduated from college, we moved my then turning 90-year-old parents from Florida, Dory will relate to all of this, added an addition, which we paid heavily on our taxes, to provide a home for my parents where we could take care of them. It's now, many years later, I now appreciate clearly the education my children received and want all of my neighbors' children to receive the same level of education as my children did. I also rely on 911 in the middle of the night to respond when I call for my dad. So I think we have this multi-generational issue in this town. The emails have been going back and forth. What I don't want to see, and what I implore you all not to do, is to be so divisive that we have our school folks, our older folks, tearing at each other, because Acton to me is a quilt, and a quilt is bounded by heavy threads. And if we lose the integrity of our quilt, we lose the integrity of our community. So as we move ahead, I'd like to see us have forums for discussion where we have our school folks and we have our elders and those of us in between, the extremes perhaps, and we come to some agreement that we all can live with, so that we don't lose our police and fire at a very, very critical time in our society. We don't lose our educational standards, and we live together in a community that comes together when we have contentious issues to face, and we work closely together. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
My name is Paul White from 8 Revolutionary Road. I've lived here for 24 years in Acton, and my children benefited mightily from the school system. I'm not going to talk about the school system. I'm interested to talk about other ways that the town spends our money. I want to make 2 points. The first one is, the time I've lived here, I've observed considerable urbanisation of this town, with very little resistance from the town administration. This, of course, brings extra costs, as we know, with the schools, etc., as well as environmental and lifestyle degradation. Along with this urbanisation is the need for expanded facilities. But the question is, do these really need to be as grandiose as they often turn out? I want to give 3 examples of this, all of which, by the way, I voted for in town meeting, and in some ways wish I hadn't done. First of these is Nara Park. Yes, indeed, we did need a swimming hole. But let's face it, did we really need such extensive parking lots and an amphitheatre? What were people thinking of? Were they thinking we were going to see Shakespeare in the Round on mosquito-infested summer evenings? Or was it motorcycle-infested rock concerts? Whatever they were thinking of, we did not need an amphitheatre. The second example is the library. Yes, we did need a new library building. present building seems to me to be full of empty rooms and even more empty stacks of shelves. Notwithstanding the building costs, such a large space needs to be heated in the winter and cooled in the summer, and it needs to be staffed. And I note that there's call for more staff in this book. My third example, which is the one that prompted me to speak this evening, is the public safety facility building. Yes, indeed, we did need a new police station. But when I saw the huge tract of land which was cleared for development of the new building, I was absolutely amazed. This building, in fact, is more appropriate to a town like Arlington than a town like Acton. And again, it needs to be heated in the winter and cooled in the summer and staffed. In future, I would like to see that the people of Acton have a much clearer view of the sort of projects which are put before them, before they vote for them at town meeting. Thank you.
Paulina Nibby, Stony Mead Way. I have a couple of comments. First of all, I'd like to commend the town selectmen, or all the town staff, for organizing this. I thought the book was excellent. I learned a lot from reading it. A couple of things I want to say in kind of a random order. One of them is when the booklet talks about the average class size in high school going up from like 21 to 25, if memory serves me. I just want to make sure that everyone in this room knows that that doesn't mean that 25 is the maximum class size. My daughter's a senior this year. She has several classes which are over 40. My son is a sophomore, and he has classes where there are not enough chairs. They have to sit on stools and balance their books to write notes on their laps. Now, some of those problems fix themselves because some kids drop out of the honors classes and into the AE classes, but just to let you know, it's not that the class sizes are 25. They're substantially higher than that now. Now, having said that, one of the things you asked us to do in this booklet was to say things that we were willing to cut, because no matter what happens, we're going to have to cut from this budget. And so I'm willing to step up and say I am going to make some of those hard choices, and some of them are hard choices. One of them is, in grade schools, I really don't think there's a lot of that. I'm a computer person. I'm a massive computer person. But I don't think there's a lot of value in the computers in the lower grades, in the first, second, third. If the computer system was only in fourth, fifth, and sixth, I don't think that's a really, really detrimental educationally, or certainly is a small thing. And I know that's not a lot of money, but it's some money. It's a chip on the table. That's personal. It's just my opinion. Another thing I would like to ask, and this is hard, because I know that there isn't any money to do anything more. But I do have to say that my children's experience in high school certainly was that some of the most valuable, life-changing experiences that they had at the high school were in the electives. And I know that the electives are one of the first things to go. And so in spite of the fact that these classes are enormous in some cases, my personal preference, and again, it's purely a personal preference, I would rather have larger classes in some areas and keep the electives than lose the electives. Another point I'd like to make, and I understand that hits a lot of kids. You know, some kids are great academically, some kids aren't, but a lot of kids can find an elective somewhere that hooks them into the school, and I think that's important. When we limit the number of classes the kids can take, there are more kids who are not in class in the school. There is not a whole lot of supervision in the school for kids because there's not a whole lot of staff to do that. I would much rather keep kids in classes and not in the halls and in the parking lot and potentially getting into trouble. Kids this age do get into trouble. They do make bad choices. I'd like to not give them the opportunities to make those bad choices by not keeping them busy. So those are my offerings on the table. I also have one other thing to say. I mean, I really appreciated what Jamie had to say about some of the things that are going on at the state level. I wanted to let people in this room know that I'm one of the co-chairs of the League of Women Voters. We are planning a forum on February 1st that will talk about state funding for education. It's not about the override. It's about how the state funds funds schools, funds education. Not a lot of people understand this. It's extremely important because it's what gets us into this hole every time. And only by understanding it can we change it so we don't get into this hole. So I really encourage people to remember February 1st. We'll put it in the newspapers. and come to Town Hall on February 1st to hear about the state funding. In particular, there's another court case which may change things in a substantial way, which may hurt Acton a lot. And people need to know about that so we can prepare and maybe be able to influence what happens. So February 1st, and I hope to see many of you there. Thank you very much.
Jesse, Liberty Farmstead Way. I'm going to try to be uncharacteristically brief. Three quick myths that I'd like to try to debunk very, very briefly. One was that when I was on the school committee, I often heard that there was a great deal of waste and a great deal of extravagance in the school budget. My experience when we went through not only section by section, but line by line, was that when you take out those things which are mandated by the state, and you take out those things which are mandated by contract, there's very little actual discretionary spending. And I sat in a meeting in which a gentleman said, quote, "Well, I haven't looked at the budget, but I know there's room to cut." And I said, great, because we're all in the room. All the people we can cut are here. Please point to the person you'd like to fire. I think we ought to keep in mind that that work of cutting to the bone not only has been done, but continues to be done. The second myth, and this one I've heard 3 times this week, and I think it's really worth putting on the table because nobody quite seems to want to say it out loud, is the converse of what the gentleman before me said. You know, if we didn't have quite such good schools, then we wouldn't have that reputation. And then all these people wouldn't move in for the schools. Then we wouldn't have to spend so much on the schools. Well, it's an appealing idea. A few years ago, the school committee got together with the finance committee and the selectmen in a group called 2020, and we said, let's do some what-if scenarios. What happens if we say, let's live with not quite as good a school system? How much do we save? What we figured out is, it's true, the affluent families who have the alternative of moving elsewhere, not so much people moving out of town, but people who would otherwise be coming into town. And please remember that most of our growth is not in new housing. It's in turnover of existing housing. So as people age out and new families come in, many of those affluent families would say, okay, the schools are not as good in Acton, let's go to Lincoln or Sudbury or somewhere else. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean demand goes down. What happens is, because the schools are not as good and people don't want to move in, there's less demand for the housing, and the housing prices come down, and so other families who otherwise couldn't afford to come here do move in with their children. So the demand stays the same. However, because the housing values have gone down, the tax base goes down. And so we're forced to make further cuts. So more affluent people decide not to come here. Less affluent people come with their children. The demand stays the same, and the resources go down. And Acton enters a very difficult to reverse downward spiral. If you decide to cut the schools, that's a decision that's perfectly, I won't say defensible, but certainly it's a decision that I could understand some people feel they must make. But don't kid yourself that by cutting the schools, you'll cut the demand. The demand will be there. What won't be there will be the value of our single most important investment, our homes. So from a purely selfish, practical viewpoint, it's a short-sighted philosophy, and it won't work. The third final piece that I would like to attack, or at least discuss, is the idea that the schools come to town meeting with a purposefully bloated budget, knowing that it will be cut. Unfortunately, and I very strongly disagree with this policy, the schools do the opposite. What happens in the school committee meeting is that the administration comes in with what they think they need, and the school committee has a series of meetings cutting and cutting and cutting. They then come to town meeting with an inadequately low budget, which town meeting then cuts further, or tries to. So I think we should approach this in good faith. And yes, we have difficult choices to make. In my mind, the choice that we truly have to make, and yes, we should cut waste where we can, but the choice that we truly have to make is what kind of town do we want to live in? And starkly put, our choice is a town with continuing services, or perhaps a little less than we're used to, and higher taxes than we're comfortable with, or a town with taxes that are more comfortable and fewer services than we're used to. That's the simple reality of the choice. There's no magic bullet, there's no rabbit to pull out of a hat. So I think we need to decide what kind of town we want to live in and what we're willing to spend for it, just like everybody else, and assume that the people who are in the leadership positions, while not infallible, are working in good faith. Thank you.
Glad we didn't have a long one.
My name is Bill Mullen, 9 Wilson Lane. And I know that probably half of these people here have served on some town boards, and that when some of these questions that are asked, there are ready answers, and you just wish you could pop up and give that answer. When people look at the information here, there is much work behind this and an easy, a straightforward explanation. So I know that people sometimes read this, and since I'm not aware of it, they think it must not be true. Well, I've been doing this around this for a long time, and you know, this is not the total facts, but it's the answers are there. But that's the second point I want to make, and this is quickly before I make my major point, which is going to be very brief, is I do take a little bit of umbrage at the question of productivity. For a long, long time, I've been thinking about productivity. I come from a finance background. I run a business now. I think about productivity every day. And in all of my time when I was at FinCom and Selectmen, we tried to think about how to improve productivity, and it has improved. There are measures of the town that are very standard measures of units of output with the same amount of labor, which shows productivity. This gentleman cited the narrow situation. I consider that one of the town's greatest, wisest investments, and I'm not going to go into a long story, but we excavated a hole down at Ice House Pond with 13,000 cubic yards of loam, and brought it up to Narra and used that loam for the loam up there. Basically, that was an equal wash. We sold the gravel as a hole in the ground. We sold the hole in the ground to build a pond. You know, so I think we've got a heck of a deal up there. And that's the type of thinking that goes on all the time. But the major point I want to make is one word, and it really takes off what Jesse just said, and the word that I have been thinking about all along is risk. The decisions you make about this all relate to risk. When people tell you that there's no fact, if there is fact, please raise your hand and come on down and tell them about it, because they'll change it. They do. If somebody's not doing their, you know, there's the classic case of the public works guy, 3 guys looking at a hole, call Don Johnson and tell him there's 3 guys looking at a hole. They will get rid of it. But the easy answers are gone, and that's what Jesse's saying. So I'm really saying the same thing about Jesse, but trying to put a little bit more focus on it, which is risk. P.M. Harding Barrett's mentioned about the ambulance. We had a situation, I'm a Pop Warner coach. We had a young girl who had a problem on the sidelines in cheerleading. The ambulance was away, took 9 minutes to get there, the young lady passed away. What level of risk do you want to accept? When we talk about risk in the schools, the major element there is labor. So what level of risk are we willing to take to try to change that? There's no free lunch. There's nothing that we can do that is easy. Everything that's easy is done. So do we want to challenge the schools and the labor unions on their wages? I mean, 80% of the costs are wages. Do we want to risk a strike? Do we want to perhaps change the program? One of the things that Bill Ryan has often said is we can do it with a slower dollar amount, but it's not going to be the same program. Should we go to distance learning tools? Should we do other things that don't have face-to-face learning? All of these things come back to, every service that you think about comes back to risk. If the fire department's late, if the police officer isn't there, if we have a major event at Nesbitt. One little anecdote on risk. In the 1998, I think it was, I headed up a program called ActonTV. And that's when people say we didn't focus on productivity. I do get a little testy on that score, but we spent 6 months and did a report, and what we concluded is one of the major savings that we could get to keep the taxes as low as we possibly could was to increase some risk in certain areas. And one of the areas that we increased the risk in was in the health trust account. Basically, and if you've been paying attention, it's been one of the budget busters over the last couple of years. We decided to draw down the balance in the trust so to keep taxes as low as we could while maintaining a certain level of services. Well, that translated just simply into higher risk in that program. Well, the risk piper called, and he came. He called 3 years later or 4 years later. So as we go through this analysis for the next 6 months or whatever it is, I just invite you to try to think about it in that term, because that's the way I've been trying to think about it for many, many years. Is the fad is gone, unless, and if you have a solution, please run down here and tell them about it, because we'll change it. But it's what level of risk are you will be willing to accept?
We've got about 40 minutes more that we can devote to this topic, so we can allow a little time for the Life After Nesbitt topic. I would like to suggest that some of us, at least, would like to hear from some people on the question, not necessarily, although we can certainly talk about that, of the dollar value of an override, but how we should structure an override, whether we should continue to go with a single unified question, or whether we should make it a pyramid, or what. There was one comment made earlier, because the leadership has been debating that internally, this would be an opportunity now or later by email to put your oar in on that subject if you want. Tara.
Tara Hendricks, Ray Terrace. First of all, I'd like to say that it's good, I think, that we're learning to live without relying on new building. Whether that's a gift from God, perhaps, in terms of the market downturn or not. Growth costs us in future infrastructure, as we're paying now for the infrastructure that is needed.